So Frank Ray's place in early Texas art pantheon is assured from his arrival in Kaufman County, Texas in 1876 until his passing in Dallas County in 1945. Mr. Ray traveled more of the Lone Star State than any artist, capturing in pastel the great Southwest that he loved to paint. Moreover, his work as an inventor changed the world, and especially his work as teaching to a listing of hundreds of future Texas artists reads like a who's who of early Texas art. And our presenter today, Michael Grauer, probably really needs no introduction, but I'm going to give you the full Monty anyway. So here, Michael R. Grauer. What's the R stand for? Ray. Oh, really? What a coincidence. Okay. Michael Ray Grauer holds a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Painting and a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Art History from the University of Kansas, Master of Arts in Art History from Southern Methodist University, and a Master of Arts in History from West Texas A&M University. He began his career at the Smithsonian Art Museum and was Curator of Art and Western Heritage at the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum for 31 years. From 2018 to 24, he was McCausland Chair of Cowboy Culture, Curator of Cowboy Collections and Western Art at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum. Michael has curated over 150 exhibitions on Western art, culture, and history, and has authored over 70 publications. And his book, Making a Hand, The Art of H.D. Bugbee, received the Western Heritage Wrangler Award for Best Western Art Book. In 2021, he was inducted into the Kansas Cowboy Hall of Fame at Dodge City, Reaugh, and as Cowboy Historian for 2021, Michael was the image editor and one of the essayists for the award-winning Making the Unknown Known: Women in Early Texas Art, 1860s to 1960s. In spring 2025, Michael started his own business, cleverly naming Michael L. Grauer, LLC. So where he now consults, guest curates, writes, and presents on all things art, history, and cultures with the usual suspects. Please welcome Michael Grauer to the stage.
We'll test the mic. It sounds like it works. I walk around a lot when I talk normally. The last time I presented at Casetta was down in San Antonio, and I read the paper formally, and that's not usually the way I do things. So we're going to do things a little differently now. Following the august scholars who presented scholarly papers before me, I'm the first male to be on the slate. So it'll be several tough acts to follow, and I hope you'll bear with me. Before we get started, I'd like to ask all veterans to please stand and be recognized. Pardon me? Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And I appreciate Scott mentioning that. I come from a long line of veterans all the way back to the Revolutionary War, including my great-great-grandfather, Thomas Kelly, who stowed away on a ship from Ireland as a 7-year-old boy, ended up in the textile mills up in upstate New York and enlisted in the Union Army, and was captured at Petersburg and served a little time at a little southern resort known as Andersonville Prison, and survived to become a farmer in Nebraska. So I'm quite proud of my ancestors who have served this great country. I'm also a great student of the Great War, First World War, World War I, and have been a longtime attendee of the annual scholarly conference they hold at the National World War I Museum and Memorial in Kansas City. And one scholar, they all stand out, but one scholar stood out and said the only time we forget veterans is when we stop saying their names. And so that's one of the reasons I wear a poppy pin all the time. It's not just for Veterans Day, it's not just for Decoration Day, but it's for all days, and we need to remember that. And when we stop saying the names of artists, That's when they fall into the dustbins of history, sadly. And I so appreciate the scholars that went before me to help us remember to say those names and look for their artwork, because they speak to us through their works of art. And that's the most important thing to remember, is to see their work, because art was not meant to stay in a museum vault or in a closet or in your own private home. You have an obligation to share. And I'm so grateful during my tenure at Panhandle Plains, especially, is the generosity of virtually every person in this room to share your collections. And I'm also cursed with a photographic memory, so I remember where your artwork is in your house. So that served me pretty well over those years, and you all were very generous. One story I'll mention is when we borrowed an L.O. Griffith for the Texas Impressionism show from Cynthia Gaydon. She didn't realize the painting would be gone for over a year when she said yes. So be careful what you say, because museum curators like to borrow things for a lot longer than you might expect. But we have to remember to say their names. And while I've done my best, and my middle name is R-A-E, not R-E-A-U-G-H, although my children for a while had a cat named Frank Ray, it is critical that we pass on these names. So I challenge you all to be thinking about that, because we have here in our audience an honored guest, Ray Schmitz. Mr. Schmitz, would you please stand and be recognized? Named after Frank Ray. And he is Light and Victoria Cummins' grandson. So there's a double whammy right there, because he carries Frank Ray's name, and that's quite a load you're going to have to carry with you, young man. Remember whose name you carry, and I know you will, and I appreciate that. But so if you have an opportunity to help name a child or a and I've got a grandson who's on his way next month, and I send them suggestions all the time, so perhaps I'll send them Bywaters. Wouldn't that be a great first name? You know, Florence, right? How many Ruths are there left? You know, so be thinking about that. So that's your homework assignment. My introduction to Frank Ray did not occur at what was then the National Museum of American Art, where Virginia Mecklenburg was kind enough to be patient with me when I was an intern there first. And then when they knew that I knew how to run a table saw, they put me in the exhibits department. So I built exhibits, and she was kind enough to always have time for me. And she was one of the people on that staff that encouraged me to go to graduate school. And I'm not going to give her full credit for this, but my only requirement for graduate school when I left the employee of the Smithsonian Institution was it had to be in Texas. And lo and behold, SMU reached out the red carpet. Somebody hit send on accident, and but I showed up anyway and learned that $17 doesn't last you very long in Dallas. Nor does not having an automobile. So that was a bit of a challenge. But nevertheless, Virginia was always very kind to me, and especially patient. And so remember that with our youngsters. We need to be patient with them at all times. Mr. Ray was always patient. And my introduction to him was, in fact, at Meadows Museum at SMU when I was assigned to inventory the University Art Collection, which sounds pretty straightforward on its face, but what they didn't tell me was I first had to find it, because it was scattered all over campus. And so I went to various buildings in and around, and I don't have time to tell you about that, but I will tell you that I didn't know how to pronounce Ray either. I thought it was Rough or Roaf or something, but then I learned very quickly that Frank Ray is a titan in Texas art. He was indeed a Renaissance man, because not only was he a great artist, one of our best, if not the best, he was also a teacher. And as you heard in the introduction, he affected Texas art on multiple levels, not just through his own work, but through his teachings. And it literally is a who's who of early Texas art. I made the mistake one time in my youthful exuberance. I wrote a letter to Jerry Bywaters and asked him, mistakenly, about his time as a student of Frank Ray. Mr. Bywaters did not answer me, but Mary Bywaters did. In a very nicely written letter, but very firm, Jerry was not his student, I was. So that letter is still up there in the Panhandle Plains file, but in any case, you learn, when we know better, we do better, right? And so I got to learn about Mr. Reaugh, catalog those art objects, finding things in professors' offices scattered all over campuses behind file cabinets. It was quite an effort. And then when the opportunity to go to Panhandle Plains Historical Museum, which when I left in 2018, had about 1,100 works of art by Mr. Reaugh, and that includes about 640 works in color, both pastel and oil, about 200 pencil drawings, and roughly around 300 or so photographic prints and glass plate negatives. Now, the glass plate negatives and the photographs are a part of Mr. Reaugh's work that I'll talk about a little bit today, but it is a part that's largely unknown and deserves a publication, in my opinion, along with other attention on Mr. Reaugh. So for full disclosure, I'm a zealot, and I'm going to try to convert every single one of you in this room. Because I believe, and I gave a talk called Frank Reaugh, the Third R of Western Art at the Whitty Museum, I think in 2019, I think that's right, on the event of the 250 years exhibition. Some of that is in this talk today, but mostly I'm going to talk to you about Mr. Reaugh, who he was and what he was as an artist, with little things sprinkled in and around. So without further ado, Mr. Reaugh recognized his place on the national landscape by comparing himself to his two contemporaries, Frederick Remington and Charlie Russell, as you can see here. And you can see he had very profound feelings about the direction he took in recording the American West. And this is the way he always thought of himself, as an American artist working in the American West. He did make reference to his time as a Texan and also was very proud of that, but at the same time he always thought nationally and sometimes internationally. So I'm not going to read the quotations to you. They're up there on the screen, but nevertheless, you can see what he thought of what Remington did to the American cowboy. Interested in the cowboy as a wild man. Now, a little side note here. No cowboy ever said yeehaw. That's what a teamster says. Because gee means left and haw means right when you're driving a wagon that's pulled by mules or oxen, okay? Cowboys don't say that. So put that out of your vernacular. So, you know, I'm a cowboy historian too, and I feel compelled to make adjustments to my colleagues in their own vernacular. So he thought also about Remington, about Charlie Russell, and he painted the cowboys of the Northwest. That's kind of terse, but nevertheless, this is how Mr. Reaugh saw his own work. But this is what he thought. I was the only artist, it seems, who thought of trail drives and Texas Longhorns as being a subject to paint. And what he meant by that was in person. Virtually everything we know from the depictions of the famous trail drives, and also that industry, that supply and demand story from driving South Texas cattle to railheads in Kansas and points beyond that extend all the way to Canada, were that they were nostalgic images or by artist reporters who were painting and drawing for publication what they thought it ought to look like. So there are an awful lot of Texas Longhorns in publication in Scribner's and Harper's that look a lot like Jerseys or Guernsey cows and don't look anything like a Texas Longhorn because they weren't out there witnessing it like Mr. Reaugh. So Charlie Russell was up in the cattle country from a middle-class childhood in St. Louis by 1882. So he's up in Montana, first working as a sheep hand and eventually as a night wrangler for cattle on big cow outfits before he became an artist. And this is probably his single most famous work of art that put him on the national map. Frederick Remington got out to Kansas about 1883, where he tried real hard to be a cowboy, but bought a sheep farm instead. Wasn't any good at that, and then he bought into a hardware store and a saloon in Kansas City. Not exactly the type of resume you want to offer your fiance and ask for her hand in marriage. So that failed miserably, and eventually he returned to New York. But Mr. Reaugh got to Texas in 1876 and immediately was captured by those Texas Longhorns who were coming up the trail near the family farm outside Terrell in Kaufman County, and also by family livestock. But he also took a trip out into what he called Western Texas. in 1883, as you can see in this gray pastel. And this is what you see in Mr. Reaugh's earliest works. Roughly from about 1880 to 1884, virtually all his work is in gray pastel because he's limited by the art supplies he can get in Terrell, Texas, and eventually makes his own pastel crayons, which would serve him throughout his career. But you can see in this small gray pastel, Mr. Reaugh wasn't very good with horses. We'll just say that right from the outset. But the important thing is this is an historical document of leading horses in western Texas on what became known as the Western Trail, on that trade that went from South Texas all the way up to western Canada. But he was also, as you can see, and you saw another slide of this with Virginia's presentation, Roundup, Texas is not only a spectacular painting of what I consider his masterpiece. The pastel's about this wide. And I think you can see, if I can do it right, do you see the dust cloud? It's not a great slide, but the dust cloud is there, and the dust that raises over a roundup of 15,000 head is pretty significant, as you can see. But the most important thing here is, as an historical document, does anybody see any trees? What we forget about is past the cross timbers, out into the short grass prairie, there are virtually no trees from that part of Texas, literally all the way to Canada. And you can see Canada from there, out near, as you can see, from near Fort Belknap. That's the important thing to remember. And we've forgotten that because the natural environment looked a certain way. So not only was he an historian about a Texas industry, he was also a historian of the natural environment. And this is how he got his start, was studying zoology and the great nature writers of the day. He also began photographing about 1889. This is one photographic print. Mr. Reaugh's glass plate negatives are divided in a couple of different collections. I'll talk about that in a minute. But this is actually a full-on photographic print mounted on what we might call the cabinet card type paper. Usually there are inscriptions down below right here. So that's where the title comes from, speckled steer facing right here. And he had a very complex numbering inventory system, which is a little hard to crack. You'd have an easier time getting into Fort Knox to figure out what it was, his numbering system. But these are true Texas Longhorns here. And Mr. Dobie talked about the fact that Mr. Reaugh was the only artist to ever paint and photograph a true Texas Longhorn before they started getting crossbred by about 1880. So they're significant. And he's, once again, an historian for Texas. So this exposure to this trail driving phenomenon, what would really set him on his life's course, started because he grew up. Here's Missouri. Illinois is right over here. This is Iowa. Illinois. Mr. Reaugh grew up and was born in Jacksonville, which is southern Illinois. That was a receiving area for cattle coming out of South Texas on the Shawnee Trail that cut through Indian Territory, a little bit of Arkansas, through eastern Missouri, up the Kansas-Missouri line, and then headed up into Chicago. Some of those cattle on the hoof going to St. Louis. But Mr. Reaugh was exposed to Texas Longhorns as a child before he ever even got to Texas. Ironically, his family took the same road, which is called the Texas Road, going south. It's the Shawnee Trail with animals on it going north, but it's the Texas Road coming south, an immigrant trail. So when the family came and stopped in North Texas, roughly about here, Mr. Reaugh was experiencing those cattle as they passed by. That's a pretty significant part of Texas history that Mr. Reaugh not only witnessed, but became part of. And so here's your best introduction to Mr. Reaugh. A couple of photographs, 1889 with the formal portrait on the left over here. He was a handsome devil, wasn't he? Absolutely. And this is a photograph of him with his field sketching. Now, this is his own folding lap easel. This is not the one that he would later invent for students to use. And he carried this and all the trappings initially on trail drives on the back of a horse. Now, if you know anything about a horse, just to help you remember this, Trigger didn't love Roy, and Champion did not love Gene Autry. They're animals. They're unpredictable, so putting all that stuff on the back of a horse, clanking around like that, Mr. Reaugh ended up on the ground. So he learned very quickly the only way to make his sketching trips was with what he referred to as a Studebaker hack, a small spring wagon that he would buy at what he called in horses, he would buy at the monthly stray sales, because horses would get loose. Nobody could find their owner, and he'd buy stray horses in Oak Cliff. And when he got back from his sketching trips, he'd sell them back. So he didn't own a vehicle all year round until he acquired the Cicada. More about that later. But when he came down that trail, the Texas road, the trail driving industry was in full force by 1876 with multiple trails going up north. And this is a reproduction of a Reaugh drawing in a we're not sure about the publication, but he, as I mentioned before, he was sketching these animals as they went by, or they, as he said, fattened on North Texas grasses. But he also was measuring family livestock, including the family oxen named Tom and Jerry, as well as sheep, and acquired a bovine anatomy book, a sheep anatomy book, and so on, training himself because he really didn't have a school to go with. So, but he taught himself all these things, and through direct observation became somewhat well known in the region. He also copied wood engravings, popular wood engravings by Scottish painters Thomas Allen, Horatio McCulloch. This is an example of one of those, and this is Mr. Reaugh's version, his copy, but he adds color to it because all he knew at this time was black and white. So this also served him well in learning the importance of strong composition. This set him up properly. Learning without the, and I happen to think this, that sometimes an artist can cheat using color. Black and white challenges the artist in terms of value relationships, and Mr. Reaugh couldn't do that because of what was available to him, so color reproductions on the family farm were not available to him until much later. So copying wood engravings, and including wood engravings for which we don't know the source. There was a well-intentioned person here in Dallas for many years who had their own version of Mr. Reaugh's biography. And in one of those versions, I think perhaps published somewhere, Mr. Reaugh, according to this person, went to the Holy Land and climbed Mount Ararat like the apostles of old. That's a bit of a paraphrase, but that's what this person said. Mr. Reaugh never went to the Holy Land. He only went across the big pond one time, and we'll talk about that. But he was fascinated by Middle Eastern culture, which we'll see again a little bit later. But these are a couple of more examples. Notice his use of color in this 1885 drawing here. He's starting to learn how to use color. He's tentative, but he also takes some pretty bold steps. There are little bits of blue and red that you can find in his work. In 1884, he completes one of his what I consider one of his masterpieces. Now, most of you know Mr. Reaugh. The standard Reaugh pastel is 3.5 by 7 inches. That became his standard. Now it varies somewhat. Many of those are field sketches. Some of them became fully finished paintings, as did Sunrise on the Prairie, which he completed in 1884, just before he began attending classes at the St. Louis Museum and School of Fine Arts, really the closest art school to where he was in Dallas. Now he became friends with the director, Halsey Ives, who would also serve him well in terms of that network throughout the Midwest and on into the East Coast. But the St. Louis School of Fine Arts was a very traditional academic institution, which including drawing from plaster casts of Greek and Roman sculpture, eventually graduating to the human figure. Mr. Reaugh was only there in the latter part of 1884 and the very early part of 1885, so he wasn't there very long. What I believe is he felt he needed some legitimacy as an artist, so his tenure there did not include a graduation of any type. He was only there briefly, but he maintained his relationship with St. Louis and Halsey Ives throughout his career. He came back to Terrell, and this is important to remember. His father, George Washington Reaugh, did not believe that art was the right kind of occupation for a male. So he listed his son's occupation on the 1880 census as farmer. So Mr. Reaugh was first a farmer in North Texas before he became an artist. His mother, on the other hand, and George Washington Reaugh was immensely skilled in multiple trades. He was a farmer, he was a carpenter, he was a cabinet maker, many things, very talented man. But it was Mr. Reaugh's mother, Clorinda Spillman Reaugh, daughter of a Presbyterian minister, who really encouraged her son in the fine arts and encouraged his reading on natural history. Louis Agassiz, for example, was one of the authors that was a favorite, and the nature writer John Burroughs. And John Burroughs preached that an artist could only have one mistress or one spouse, and that was your art. And that held fast with Mr. Reaugh throughout his career. Eventually, he came back to Terrell, taught public school, as well as founded a form of the Frank Reaugh Art Club, most of his students were females, and often were children of local ranchers, in particular, two brothers, Frank and Romeo Houston. And he went on cattle drives with the Houston brothers in their Red River Land and Cattle Company in both Montague and Clay County and Red River County a little bit. But nevertheless, he taught their daughters. And Stella Houston is one of the young ladies in this photograph. I'm sorry, I can't identify her. But the Houston brothers play a huge role in Mr. Reaugh's career, because I believe they were probably his sponsors to go train at the Académie Julian in Paris. Now, the Académie Julian was one of what were called the petits ateliers, the small studios around Paris where American or other international students were welcomed, because most Americans could not qualify for the École des Beaux-Arts, the primary French art school. Americans are pretty well beyond the pale as far as that's concerned. They're just frontiersmen and so on. And so to welcome them into these effete art schools was not something that happened. But they could attend classes by professors from the École at the Petit Atelier, like Académie Julian here, run by a man named Reaugh Julian, who brought in those professors to teach. Now, interestingly, Julian was one of the few that had both a male and female studio. Not all of them did. And so the Académie Julian is critical to our early Texas art story, because a couple of other things happened too. So Mr. Reaugh was there, and he sets out, and in his correspondence with his mother, he's trying to learn the French language and so on. It's a pretty interesting story. But while he's in France, there's a couple other Texans people there. Now, you can talk to some other folks in the studio audience. Randy Tibbetts can talk to you about at length about Emma Richardson Sherry right here in the middle, Dawson Watson here, who are at Giverny. I don't know that Mr. Reaugh went to Giverny. I want to think that he did, but I can find no evidence that he actually did. And of course, Seymour Thomas was there as well at the same time. Now, interestingly, in the logbook for the Académie Julian, Mr. Reaugh's residence is listed as Kansas. Now, being a native Kansan, that makes me feel a little bit good, but as an adopted Texan, it's a little confusing. But nevertheless, he's there while these three Texans, who eventually become pillars of early Texas art. He's also there when this painting is shown. Now, think about that. Speaking of modernism, where's Katie? Yeah, it's little bitty, but it was hung on the walls of the Académie Julian while Mr. Reaugh was there. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, it's a tiny little painting. That notwithstanding, its size notwithstanding, what does this represent? The exposure of our friend Mr. Reaugh to European modernism on a big scale. And look how early it is, 1888. Did Mr. Reaugh carry those things back? I challenge you to say that he did. Mr. Reaugh also followed the regular curriculum, and these two academies, studies from the live model, are housed in boxes at the University of Texas. I hope someday they'll receive proper conservation treatment. That's always my hope. I want to save all the buildings. I want to save all the paintings. I want to save all the prints. I want to save it all. But I understand about priorities, but these are well cared for in that climate-controlled environment, and that's important. So they're down there. And just something kind of curious, this young model here looks an awful lot like that young model there in the women's studio. So, somebody in here who's talented could write a novel about the that sort of thing. Anyway, what Mr. Reaugh also aimed to do, because he knew of old master paintings through those black and white reproductions I mentioned before, he went on a tour in and around Paris. He walked everywhere, of course, but he eventually toured through Belgium and into the Netherlands and then back to Paris. And a couple of paintings that we know he experienced seeing, of course, was this great Plowing at Nivernais by Rosa Bonheur, and then Paulus Potter's Young Bull. Well, of course he likes the cow paintings, right? Because, he's just a cow painter, right? So he goes and he probably makes copies on some level because he was an inveterate copyist. He also eventually made his way into, as I mentioned, Belgium and Holland. And he was captivated by a Dutch artist named Anton Mauve, as you can see here. So he eventually brings some of those lessons with him by either observing and or copying these Dutch masters. And he also is greatly influenced to become part of that bohemian art scene, complete with cravat and a straw hat for painting, like our friend here. And notice when remember, does anybody know when Van Gogh left the earth? Look it up on your phones. So, Mr. Reaugh, would he have been exposed to these works? You know, he doesn't really tell us everything that he saw, but there are certain things we can conclude that he did see. But there he is in a self-portrait also at the HRC. We know he traveled around and painted French and Belgians in Dutch scenes, as you can see here, Barnyard in Winter, and also Bull by Hayrick. Are a couple of examples looking at European cattle images in the wild. But he also was most influenced by a group of artists then very popular in the Netherlands called the Hague School, based in The Hague, amongst whom are Paul Gabriel, as you can see here, and just notice the similarities between this small oil painting. Mr. Reaugh did do small oils on canvas, slightly bigger than the 3.5 by 7, usually treated with gum arabic as a primer because it made it have a tooth, much like the paper that he created the same way. But they're small handmade canvas panels that he treated. But that aesthetic and bringing along the scale, and I saw several of these when I followed in Mr. Reaugh's footsteps, and I should have told you that. In 1988, I received a traveling fellowship from SMU and spent a month in Paris, and then the last week of that was following Mr. Reaugh wherever he went, through Belgium and Holland, and eventually down through Germany, because I like to think he went to Rome too. He didn't. But that's where I ended up. But we got to see some of these paintings in person, and they're usually of small size, but the scale is quite similar to the work that Mr. Reaugh would do later. The Hague School, William Reaugh, as you can see here, another one of those Hague School artists that influenced what Mr. Reaugh would paint. There is a large example of this painting, which the small pastel is a tiny one, it's about this big, is at the HRC as well. He also recorded as souvenirs his travels around France, Belgium, and Holland in ink drawings, and who knows if he was influenced by yet another Hague School artist, Paul Gabriel, as I mentioned before. But he recorded windmills, of course, Dutch school children, a Dutch canal. And I'm proud to say I tried really hard to walk along the Seine and find this very place, and I think I got pretty close to it. But I challenge you to walk around Paris, because I didn't bring any other shoes but cowboy boots. So walking on the cobblestones on the banks of the Seine, the quays of the Seine, there's better footwear for that sort of thing. So you learn, when you know better, you do better. When Mr. Reaugh got back to Paris after his Dutch and Flemish tour, he got back just in time to enjoy the Exposition Universelle, at which were shown paintings by the Impressionists, including Edouard Manet. We heard about Manet earlier today. Brilliant lecture, by the way. But he also saw, amongst those groups of artists, one of my favorite Monet paintings called The Magpie. And look, just compare really quickly with his Barnyard in Winter. Was Mr. Reaugh influenced by those Impressionist painters? Now, Mr. Reaugh eventually became a staunch proponent or opponent of anything what he considered modern, at least according to what others told us. We'll talk about that a little bit later. When he returned to Texas, he immediately started work on finishing a pastel he had started before he left. So this is an 1887 field sketch called Watering the Herd, painted near Henrietta, just west of Henrietta, and eventually finished the large-scale Watering the Herd. It's spectacular, as you can see, just west of Henrietta in Clay County. He was familiar with that kind of country because he would travel up basically where 287 goes, up into that part of the country. This is a man-made stock tank right there with a cowboy on the and not saying yeehaw, by the way. But in any case, this is Mr. Reaugh still holding on to those old ideas before he went to Europe. But this is also something of a flashpoint because his work changes dramatically immediately upon finishing this. Now, we've heard mention about the art that was shown at the State Fair of Texas, and it began really about 1888. Mr. Reaugh was right in the middle of that from the very beginning. And as you can see by this designation here, I believe he probably was securing works of art by artists from the Midwest and the Atlantic coast, largely outside New York City, as early as 1888, and he continued that up until 1906. Now, for most historians of the State Fair of Texas, they usually credit those art exhibitions to Julian Onderdonk and before him his father, Robert. Obviously, Mr. Reaugh was in the middle of that. The Onderdonks had connections to Baltimore and New York. Mr. Reaugh had the entire Midwest because he had connections, and I'll show you why in a minute. But he also had connections up into New England and elsewhere to borrow works of art from these artists. And those of us who are curators in here, you know, to have someone like that out in the field, being a field agent for us, that's gold. I mean, that's gold to have those connections. So I wanted to point that out. This is what he's doing as his career developed. He also starts to take trips out to West Texas beginning in about 1890, and on occasion he needed introductory letters like this one to Charles Goodnight in 1893 in October, written by a Dallas banker. Basically, a letter of introduction, if you're not familiar with that, often took you to a new part of the world or a new part of a country and introduced you to whomever it was you wanted to visit. Charles Goodnight, by this time, was settled near what's now Goodnight, Texas, and he had already established that part of what was left of the J.A. Ranch. Mr. Reaugh painted small pastels in lower Palo Duro Canyon at that time. Here are two examples up in Canyon. But he also photographed what was called Goodnight's Buffalo Ranch and also his nature park. So the photograph on the left is actually elk, because he had something of a menagerie along with the bison that he'd saved from extinction that eventually were shipped down to what's now Caprock Canyons State Park. So Mr. Reaugh was there and taking his camera as well as his pastels. I believe he was probably one of the first artists to photograph what's today known as the lighthouse in Palo Duro Canyon. I'm not saying he's the first photographer in the canyon, but he was probably the first one to photograph the lighthouse. And this one over here is Capitol Peak. You cannot see the lighthouse except on foot from the state park, but you can drive by Capitol Peak. How many of you have visited Palo Duro Canyon? Excellent. Excellent crowd response. I'm so pleased. Mr. Reaugh also painted in pastel what he called the chimneys. So this is the lighthouse again, in person on plein air. And then there's this is the pastel version, and there's a slightly larger version at the University of Texas. He preferred Toole Canyon a little ways south. He also preferred Toole Canyon because he felt the colors were a little subtler and not as intense when he started taking students. He felt the colors of the main Palo Duro were a little too overwhelming to a novice. And so he really loved to take the students down to Toole Canyon. Say more about that in a minute. He continued to photograph across West Texas. This is one of my favorite images, and I know the emulsion went sideways. I know that. But it's a cool art image, isn't it? It's one of my favorite Reaugh photographs, and this is one of the supplementary photographs taken near the O Roundup. Here's a couple of cowboys cutting out too, as you can see. Cowboys with the remuda. And also a photograph. Now, Mr. Reaugh rarely used photographs as direct sketching tools, except in the occasion of the painting called Mr. Jack. Is Kevin Vogel in here? The Vogels at one time had the large version of Mr. Jack. That's the small pastel version there on the left. And as I told you, Mr. Reaugh struggled with horses. Mr. Reaugh's typical working method was to make a field sketch of a scene that he witnessed on plein air, take the sketch in pastel back to his studio. By this time, it's in Oak Cliff by 1890. Tack the working sketch above his easel, and on the easel platform where you have an oil, he would work off that. So these are field notes in many respects. And he was somewhat, from the students that I interviewed, he was a little cavalier with some of the field sketches. He would take them off the field easel and throw them on the ground, and the students would be chasing them across the field wherever they were to save them. He rarely signed them. Those were a tool for him, and so that's important to remember. So you can see this wonderful oil here. I believe that all over Texas there are what I call medium-sized Reaugh oils, because we don't know where all of them are. They do pop up from time to time, so be on the lookout. I've yet to ever seen one. I did see a Reaugh pastel in a garage sale in Amarillo, but being a museum person, I had to walk away because we can't do that. We can't take advantage of those kinds of things because it's unethical. This is just another example of his work in terms of that trail driving life that no one else thought was worthy of the brush in person. And eventually this results in his being invited to exhibit at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. February in Texas. This is the sketch. The big version is somewhere. We don't know where it is. But that was one of two examples that he exhibited. This is just a document confirming that with the World's Columbian Exposition, a critical exhibition for American Impressionism because Chicago became a great supporter for that movement. This is the other one. This is in a private collection in Texas. That's the best photograph I was allowed to take because these people are very, very concerned about security. This turned up in Illinois in a private collection, a family collection, and eventually made it back. It is in Texas, I can tell you that. That's all I can tell you. But it's quite spectacular. I did get to see it in person. It's pretty killer, as you can see. So he's in a World's Fair by 1893. Elevated his reputation by, in 1895, he had paintings accepted at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. As Virginia Mecklenburg pointed out to us earlier, these were incredibly important steps in the development of an accepted artist here in Texas. To be accepted at the Pennsylvania Academy, I would venture to say second only to the Academy of Design in terms of the annual exhibition. And lo and behold, this is one example. The large version, of course, at the University of Texas. He also, because I've never been able to find In the Woodlot, this is the best approximation of what In the Woodlot looked like, which he exhibited at the Pennsylvania Academy and also at the New York Watercolor Club in 1895. That painting, in fact, belongs to the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa, along with about 4 other Frank Ray large-scale paintings. So Thomas Gilcrease, who opened his first museum in San Antonio in the 1930s before he took his marbles and went back to Oklahoma, acquired Frank Ray paintings. An astute collector of that caliber was acquiring Frank Ray as well. This exhibition exhibited at the Art Institute of Chicago, as you can see. So Pennsylvania Academy, Art Institute of Chicago, New York Watercolor Club. This is where Mr. Ray is showing his work. Sheepherder's Camp, the large version, eventually ended up being secured by Heritage and is now in a private collection. This is another example from the Gilcrease Museum called Summertime, and Mr. Ray continued to exhibit nearly annually in the American art exhibitions at the Art Institute of Chicago. Roundup was exhibited in a one-man show at Laredo Taft's Sculpture Studio in Chicago. The Dallas Art Association, or the pre-form of that, invited Mr. Taft to Dallas and put him up in one of the nice hotels downtown for an exhibition because his work was well known. He was a bit of a rock star in the United States in the mid-1890s, so he was friends with Mr. Ray. And the Chicago Press had nice things to say about Roundup, as you can see, and in particular the writer Hamlin Garland, very prolific writer out of Chicago and a very big proponent of American Impressionism from there. And he and Ray eventually became friends, to the point where they would exchange, as you'll see here in just a minute. Like a good Westerner, in his November 1898 letter, Garland proposed a swap to Mr. Ray, and they eventually traded paintings for books. And so Mr. Ray's library includes a number of Garland books, including Maine Traveled Roads, inscribed to Mr. Ray, as you can see. In 1897, as if he didn't have anything else to do, Mr. Ray founded one of the first art schools in Dallas, the Dallas School of Fine Arts. It had an office, or it had its studios downtown initially and eventually moved to Oak Cliff, 1897. And then he exhibits Watering the Herd at the National Academy of Design in 1896. That's huge. That's huge for any American artist, but especially for an artist from Texas. There's his acceptance and also the rules and regs to show in the annual American Art Exhibition at the National Academy of Design. About the same time, he joins the newly formed Society of Western Artists. Now, it has kind of a bit of a misperception because the Western artists were almost exclusively in the Midwest United States, based in Cincinnati and Chicago and Cleveland, Grand Rapids, Michigan, and so on. Some of them were names that we recognize, but Mr. Reaugh became part of what's known as the St. Louis chapter because it was the closest chapter to him. Joseph Henry Sharp, part of the Taos Art Colony, along with Bert Phillips, also from Taos, were also part of that Society of Western Artists, and he exhibited with them for a number of years. Breezy Morning that you see here turned up in a barn in Iowa just a few years ago. Some of you may remember it. But this is a little bit of where he exhibited, a little bit of the exhibition history of where Mr. Reaugh exhibited, and particularly in Texas at the Texas Coast Fair in Galveston in 1896, which Randy Tibbetts argues is one of the most important early exhibitions for Texas art historically. It also went to the Tennessee Centennial. As you can see, he was invited for a one-man show at Colorado Springs, annual exhibition at the Art Institute of Chicago, St. Louis Exposition, and then it toured with the Society of Western Arts. That's pretty tall order, but he sold it for $100. $100 to this gentleman from Kansas City. So a photograph of Mr. Reaugh in 1900, that's what his studio looked like before he built his later studio we're more familiar with. You'll notice up here at the top, that's the field stitch tacked to the easel and the larger oil that he's working on here, surrounded by sketches and paintings in progress. These are all field sketches. There are little studies of cattle here, but these are all field landscape sketches surrounded by them by 1900. Spectacular photograph that most of you are all probably quite familiar with. So this is the some material about the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. That's the Fine Arts Building here. That's what it looked like in the interior. This is where Mr. Reaugh exhibited. That was a big deal to be in a World's Fair. Frederick Remington exhibited there as well, primarily illustrations, as did Charlie Russell in the Montana Pavilion. However, 10 years later, Mr. Reaugh was invited to a second World's Fair, this time the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis, where sculptors such as Solon Borglum decorated the entire main thoroughfare with large-scale monumental sculptures in plaster, now no longer extant. Frederick Remington did his monumental sculpture now called Coming Through the Rye, but called Cowboys Off the Range. You can see the size of these sculptures. See, this is the figure standing next to it right here. And of course, Charlie Russell exhibited as well in the Montana Pavilion. But Mr. Reaugh was also invited to exhibit, secured another World's Fair spot in the Rain at the now owned by the HRC. And then he contributes to founding the Dallas Art Association in 1903, not only pushing that there should be a new public gallery in the new Carnegie Library, but donating a painting from his own collection to start the art collection. I know Sue knows this, but think about that. He is a founder on a different kind of level, a patron on a different kind of level than those who are contributing. And of course, monetary support is one thing, but for an artist to donate a prize work for that collection, and it's a version of driving the herd, that's now at the DMA. He's well thought of all over Texas, and Ernst Reaugh, a photographer from San Antonio, took this photograph. I apologize for its quality. It needs conservation, as you can see. But Ernst Reaugh, of course, was part of the Brass Muggers Club in San Antonio, an artist group that included Jose Arpa, the Onderdonks, and many others as part of that group. So they included Mr. Reaugh as someone who was worthy of respect and honor with this photograph. It's one of the few photographs you see of Mr. Reaugh as you would think an artist with beret and shawl and all that kind of stuff. He really didn't get into that kind of thing. He never took a selfie as far as I know. He's invited to join the National Art Society by 1910, which was a big deal to join these national organizations. Now anybody can put out a shingle and say, you're whatever. But in these days, in 1910, the National Art Society in Chicago meant something. In about 1913 and 14, and this is unclear whether he was invited or he asked to be invited to tour the ranches of John B. Kendrick. John B. Kendrick had been a trail driver out of South Texas, orphaned when he was about 9, became a trail driver, drove herds up to Wyoming at least 3 times and eventually stayed in Wyoming, and eventually bought out the ranches where he worked in both northeastern Wyoming and southeastern Montana. He eventually became state senator of Wyoming. He eventually became governor of Wyoming and eventually U.S. senator from Wyoming. And because of his ranching interest in Montana, he was often referred to as the third Montana senator because he often fought for issues in Montana. While Mr. Reaugh was there, and I apologize for the quality of this slide, Mr. Reaugh considered this his finest landscape in oil. As you can see, it's called Powder River. And the Hereford cattle that are right down here really don't take center stage anymore. It's really the Powder River country. And this is where Mr. Reaugh's genius comes through in many respects, is his ability to capture landscapes, not only in the Southwest, but also on the northern plains as well. He hoped to sell this to Governor Kendrick, whose mansion called Trails End is a place you can visit as a Montana or a Wyoming State Historic Site. I was able to do that a couple of months ago. Governor Kendrick didn't really buy art, and so Mr. Reaugh brought it back to Dallas. The sketches that he left there are still in the family, in the Kendrick family, and the great-grandchildren still have reminiscences of remembering when Mr. Reaugh came to town. So it was a big deal when this famous artist came to the family ranch. So his sketching trips were usually alone initially. L.O. Griffith and some others, Charles Peter Bach and some others, started going with Mr. Reaugh out to West Texas in the early 1890s. This is a printed program from the 1911 Transllano Sketch Association that Mr. Reaugh took in 1911, and everyone had assigned duties, as you can see. So if E.G. Eisenlohr was the tenderfoot, Mr. Eisenlohr didn't do a lot of camping out, let's say. So riding in the wagons wasn't something he was used to doing. Let's go back. There's the spring wagon right there, here in the background. Big sombreros, of course, as you go. Sleeping out in army tents or whatever it was they used. The chef is A.E. Griffith. Not sure who this is. Bargelbaugh was a Dallas architect. Mr. Spillman was Mr. Reaugh's uncle. These are the names of the horses, okay, who went along. Those sketching trips continued to evolve until he started using automobiles, and eventually a well-known automobile called the Cicada. Sometimes it would tow a Model T converted into a trailer, one called the Tarantula, one called the Ant. They went all over West Texas, out to Big Bend, down to Terlingua, up in the Texas Panhandle, into the Canadian River Breaks, etc. They also extended into New Mexico, visiting the Taos Art Colony, and extended all the way out to Grand Canyon in 1921 and came back. Mr. Reaugh's pastels of Grand Canyon are absolutely exquisite, and I cannot show you images of them because it doesn't do them justice, and I don't want to do that to you. But nevertheless, and Mr. Reaugh never drove a car. So we always had a driver. I think Reaugh Bassett may be the driver in here. There's Reaugh over here. That's Reaugh Bassett right there. There's Mr. Reaugh right in the middle. Notice he always wore a tie. He thought an artist should be dressed with dignity. He also founded a nature study club called the Stygian Club, which takes its name from the Latin phrase for owls called Stygidae. And little owlets are what they were called, and it was a young women's study club. And as you can see, he thought well of women. Women are every bit as capable as men. Women would make greater names for themselves in all lines if they were encouraged as men are. Women are not as strong as men, but they are quicker. It is the female who is fierce. I can tell you that from personal experience. If women would quit spending so much time worrying about being fashionable socially, they could raise an army of Amazons and rule the world. So Mr. Reaugh felt strongly about the place for women in Texas art and world art, and even to the point where he founded a very formalized club called the Stygian Club, as I mentioned before. He designed their uniforms. They had ceremonials to play along with. I have 2 daughters now, and I know how important this sort of thing is to play dress up and do all those things. I'm just being a dad here, just bear with me. But in any case, that study of nature was critical, but also studying art from around the world was part of the Stygian Club's message. And he exposed them not only to traditional art from the Western world, but also Asian art, as you can see here in this Japanese image here, Japanese work here. And these are both by Mr. Reaugh. They look strangely Japanese, don't they? He was so sensitive in the way he approached nature, really unparalleled. The Frank Reaugh Art Club was founded formally in Oak Cliff in 1922. A couple of covers from not only the program for membership, but also for the annual exhibition of the Frank Reaugh Art Club. By the early 20s, Mr. Reaugh had really basically stopped exhibiting nationally, something really that tapered off about 1915. He stopped sending works there, and he turned his attention to teaching and to inventing. And that's a whole lecture for another time, for another group not associated with art. But he regretted this decision because he literally fell off the national map, and he knew it. And so eventually he settled into hopefully taking care of the paintings that he had already created, but continued to take sketching trips out to West Texas. However, in 1924, one of the leading galleries for Western art, the Finley Gallery in Kansas City, which had been handling Frederick Remington's work since about 1908, invited him to be part of a major exhibition on important painters of the West. By this time, they're also showing Charlie Russell's work, ironically. Mr. Reaugh declined, as near as I can tell, but it showed that on a national level there were those who still remembered him. He always wanted to build a Spanish, Moorish style studio and enlisted the help of architect Jim Cheek here in Dallas to take his own sketches and turn them into formalized plans. And we heard about draftsmen earlier today. These are exquisite drawings. Obviously, they need conservation, but all the drawings of what El Seville would look like. It never reached this level, but it's very much in keeping to what was happening in Highland Park Village, obviously, and in other parts of the country, the recognition of Spanish colonial architecture. Mr. Reagh's swan song was 24 Hours with Herd. I've got the date 1931, really was when he completed it, but he was casting about for a place to show it. I would venture to say it's the first performance art piece ever created in the state of Texas, because not only was it 7 paintings that he'd created about the life of a trail drive, but also it included music, it included prose, and it was a collaborative effort between David Guillon and Clyde Walton Hill to create this multimedia masterpiece. He cast about for various places to show it. He wanted to show it in Oak Cliff and eventually settled at the Highland Park Fine Arts Center in 1932. I think is Howard in here? I don't remember exactly. I think it was about 2016 or 17 when the San Angelo Museum of Fine Arts curated a Reaugh exhibition and also tried to recreate on some level 24 Hours with the Herd. Now, their version doesn't match exactly what Mr. Reaugh created. I do know that I was present where's Ron Tyler? Ron Tyler performed this, if I'm not mistaken, at the Art Center in Kaufman, in Terrell, right? And then I believe it was the Austin Symphony, if I'm correct, Jeff, also performed that. But I can find no recordings of that. But I would like to play you a little bit of the version that they created at San Angelo, and they asked me to do the narration. Now, that was a very humbling thing to use Mr. Reagh's words in a performance. So I'm going to play you just a little bit of that if I still have time. Go ahead.
This series of paintings was suggested by a brief article published many years ago in the magazine Outing, written evidently by an experienced cowman. They are reminiscent of my first trips to the Western Plains in the early 80s, when it was still a free grass country. There were a few scattered ranch houses, or rather range headquarters, with perhaps a corral or two nearby, But the range was open. The water holes were free for all, and the several trails that wound northward, the Chisholm Trail and others less famous, swung this way or that to reach water or a good crossing, but were not cut or diverted by lines of wire fence. The barbed wire had not come yet, nor the nester, nor the sheep. Much of my exceptional opportunity to sketch and study the West and the range life of those early days I owe to the brothers Frank and Romeo Houston. They were cousins, I believe, of General Sam Houston. Frank Houston was a beef cattle man and handled several 100,000 head of cattle annually. His activities covered the state, but withal, he had ever an appreciative eye for the beauty and romance of it. Romeo Houston, much younger, was a college man with a flair for natural science. He knew from observation, books, and Indian lore the flowers and the animal life of the West, and he was the most skillful cowboy I ever knew. I like to think back to the days I spent with those two men. Driving the herd. The rocky hilltops are capped with shin oaks. Down on the creek, a few cottonwood and hackberries grow. Occasionally there is a feathery mesquite, but for the most part the miles and miles of rolling prairie are covered only with a sparse growth of brownish-gray bunch grass and golden-yellow curly mesquite. Often the pink soil shows through. On level stretches is a hint of mirage, and on the far horizon a butte is pale and blue against the sky. All of it shimmers and glows opalescent under the intense light of the midday sun. Along the side of a wide valley, coulee, almost a canyon, dug deep from the prairie's surface by uncounted centuries of rare but torrential rains, winds the dusty, much-worn trail. Along it for half a mile before us extends a motley mass of varied color, red and yellow, black, brown, and white, like an inland, slowly moving flood with surface of bobbing horns and swaying shoulders and lashing tails. Among them everywhere rise tributary streams of hazy dust.
While this was read, not by Mr. Ray, but by a narrator, music would occur at different intervals while the paintings were sitting on an easel. Each painting would be exchanged for the next in sequence, and music selected by Mr. Ray would be played many times by Josephine Oliver, who was a very accomplished violinist, and Mr. Ray supported her in her violin studies and also bought her a high-end violin for her own career later on. And so it really is, Mr. Ray was Judy Chicago long before there was Judy Chicago. So his 24 hours with the herd was a happening. Okay, so that's just some of the narration. Some of you probably saw the 26th exhibition at the University of Texas that Peter Mears put together. It was fantastic. I can tell you that 24 Hours with the Herd has not existed very well. Mold got on some of the paintings, and so many of those were almost completely repainted by Reaugh Bassett. So there's very little of them left that's actually by Mr. Ray's hand, sadly. We'll talk about that at another time. This is an oil version of the last painting in the series called Distant Herd Going. And it occurred to me, and I didn't intend to do this, although sometimes I do when I talk about Mr. Ray, especially with all this talk of modernism today. And I'll often show this painting next to a Mark Rothko painting and talk to you about bands of color and color field painting. So if you squint your eye and pretend there's no cowboy in there, that taints the whole scene, of course. Notice the bands of color. Now, if this was a great slide, you would see them much more readily. Now, Mr. Ray would be horrified to be compared to one of the great color field painters, but nevertheless, he was a color field painter. He just might insert an anecdotal cow here, mesquite tree there, or a cowboy, believe it or not. Something to keep in mind. Now, we've heard a lot about the 1936 Texas Centennial Exposition in Dallas, which is a brand new fine arts museum, fully air conditioned. However, in the many, many galleries and the hundreds of works of art that were shown there, including major exhibitions, probably the greatest exhibition of Texas art ever held, Mr. Ray was not welcomed. He was not exhibited. He found this out because he felt like he deserved, given being a founder of the Dallas art community, that he ought to be given at least a room next to the Remington one-room exhibition that they had. But he was declined, and therefore he sought a vendor's license along with the cotton candy and hot dog salesman to show his work in a booth. He finally couldn't stand the insult and eventually was granted a canvas awning near the livestock building, which on one level is sort of appropriate, but at the same time, this is one of the greatest artists in Texas who's shoved off to the side of the livestock building near the woofus. I don't know if he was near the woofus. That's just in there for pictorial effect. But nevertheless, that's where he showed 24 hours with the herd, outside and not really as effective as it could be, for shame, frankly. However, he was invited to bring 24 hours with the herd to the Fort Worth Frontier Centennial Exposition. But he felt basically that I've committed most of my life to Dallas, and I want to remain true to my hometown. And so he showed it under a canvas awning in Dallas. And as we learned earlier, that the composition of those Western art exhibits in Fort Worth were comprised as you see here. He did send this painting to Fort Worth, so there was one painting by Mr. Reaugh that went to Fort Worth for that centennial show. But that was it. Was not shown in Dallas to any great fervor. Mr. Reaugh remained true to the Southwest. As you can see, it's the beauty of the great Southwest as God has made it that I love to paint. And what I show you is a comparison of Ralph Waldo Emerson's self-portrait as the transparent eyeball, where he is in fact absorbing the hand of God through him and as a channel for honoring the greatness of the great maker. And when I see this, and I threw this up on the screen the first time some years ago, I thought this was perfect when Mr. Eisenlohr, this is a painting by Frank Eisenlohr, or Edward Eisenlohr, called My Country 'Tis of Thee. And it was a gift from Eisenlohr's niece to Panhandle Plains. Her name was Gertrude Heimley. I think it was under the bed in her bedroom when she donated it to Panhandle Plains. But nevertheless, there he is with his personal lap easel and umbrella out in the great Southwest that he loved to paint. And I always was struck by the similarities here. I don't know that Eisenlohr, and he probably didn't know about the Emerson drawing, but it's pretty poignant when you see them side by side. So just a little rundown, a little synopsis of where Frank Reaugh exhibited outside the great state of Texas, as you can see. That's a pretty substantial track record as an American artist, any American artist. And I don't remember who mentioned it, but the Macbeth Galleries right here in New York City, Commercial Gallery, when you were invited to show your work at Macbeth, that was beyond arriving. That was very significant, and Mr. Reaugh was invited to show there. Obviously, as I mentioned before, he showed at the Texas Crow's Fair. He nearly always exhibited at the Fort Worth Annuals unless the travels got in the way. He did have a solo exhibition, and sorry about this, Sue. After they had their Golden Jubilee exhibition at the Dallas Museum of Fine Arts in 1938, somebody realized they'd forgotten Frank Reaugh. So they gave him a solo show the following year. It's sort of like being vice president, you know. There's something about, John Nance Garner said something about being vice. Look it up. But just a little reminder, he helped found the Dallas School of Fine Arts in 1997, founder of the Dallas Art Association, today the Dallas Museum of Art in 1903. So while I was at SMU, my mentor there was John Lunsford. And John Lunsford was a lifetime resident of Oak Cliff. And we would often drive around Oak Cliff and he'd talk about things that he saw as a little boy. And we once drove by Mr. Reaugh's studio at 5th and Crawford, El Seville, what was still there. And he told me, I remember as a little boy driving by and seeing this wild-haired old man standing out on the lawn, looking off into the distance. And this is another photograph of Mr. Reaugh. That's one of the paintings of 24 Hour with the Herd sitting on the easel. Here he is sitting by the stage in El Seville that's no longer there. And I forgot to thank Scott Chase, because Scott Chase helped pave the way for me to visit El Seville in 2014. And it was really critical for me to be in places where Mr. Reaugh was. So I've traveled virtually this entire state by automobile, especially out into the western parts, down to Terlingua, out into Big Bend, all across and following the rivers, the Brazos, the Pease, the Little Wichita, whatever it is, because I learned this from historian Alvin Lynn, that we have to be in places where Spirit lives, and Mr. Reaugh's Spirit lives in these places. So when I think about Mr. Reaugh standing on his front yard, looking off, and John always said he always looked confused and disoriented when he was out there with his hair waving in the wind. I like to think that Mr. Reaugh was looking off to the west, and his fingers were itching for a pastel. Thanks. Mr. Reaugh designed and made many of his own frames. He still had all of his father's block planes and molding frames, or his dad made a lot of them. Now his toning that he used, and you could only see it in one slide. The toning that he used is sort of an olive drab color. He knew color sense, and he knew that it made the color pop in the pastels. And so that toning is Mr. Reaugh's. He built a lot of the frames, and most of his pastels are usually in like what we'd call 6-ply mat board. They're about 1/4 inch thick. And then he would tone those too, typically. And he also ordered frames out of Chicago later on, but most of his paintings for the large, or his frames for the large paintings, are his own design and his own manufacture.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Short.
I'm curious to know, as he's traveling, what kind of familiarity might have had with some of the British landscape painters. Early constables had a beautiful lateral quality turn, of course.
Yeah, if Mr. Reaugh kept tally sheets for all of his paintings, and they're a little hard to decipher, but in the left-hand column, there's usually a masterpiece by a Turner, a Constable, one of the Scottish painters. And the only way I think the tick marks work is, this is how often I referred to that in my own mind when I was making this. And it's very complex, and there are hundreds of them. Dina Craighead is the curator at the Pantheon Plains now. You can ask her about those. But there are hundreds of them. And I tried my best to try to decipher them, but he did. He kept hundreds of black and white reproductions of old masters. Loved the British landscape painters, he did. Loved Moran, loved Bierstadt, all the great landscape painters. No question.
And you could talk to us about being into, say, Bavaria or Austria.
There is a possibility he got into the tip of Germany. That's not been confirmed. It looks like he just made a circle up to Amsterdam and then came back to Paris. He did visit the Rijksmuseum. We do know that. He went to the Marie-Suisse in The Hague as far as museums, but doesn't look like he ever got to Germany.
Some years ago, can't remember the date, you participated along with some other people that are actually in this audience of a great video on Frank Reaugh, pastel poet of the Texas Plains. Marla Fields, who was the director of that and the reason why it got done, has passed away. Do you know of where it stands and how that maybe we can get that video back?
Actually, that was going to be my challenge to Cassetta. I just forgot. Cassetta undertook to write that, to fund that great book, Making the Unknown Known. I'd like to throw out the challenge to Cassetta because I think there are one or two attorneys here who can hold on, let me finish.
I contacted Grauer, the lawyer, the state lawyer.
Thank you, Scott, thank you. And let's finish what Marla started, because their film is beautiful, it's spectacular, and it ought to be out where everybody can see it. And it seems like a ready-made project for Cassetta to get behind, to figure it out.
We have a website, we can post it on our website, maybe stop these things that we're trying to sell, out in the marketplace. Submit it, let us give the story.
Yep.
She always wanted it showed on a national level. And not just, and no offense, not just on a website. She wanted it on where you could see it. And so you people smarter than me, please take it on. I do hope it happens. Thank you, George, for the reminder. I sure appreciate that. I better get off the stage. Anyway, much obliged, everybody.